Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 68 for Sunday the 12th of January 2020, and this week's episode is entitled Shakespeare at the Cinema. In part 1, this week's show, we will be looking at Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, and next week we will tackle Laurence Olivier's Richard III. My name is Martin Darlington, and this week, for the first half of this episode, we see me flying solo as Andrew is busy beavering away down under where he's preparing our next joint episode, Frost Nixon. However, you will be spared from hearing only my voice. In the first part, where I'll cover Henry V, we have several clips from the movie, and for the second part, Richard III, I am absolutely delighted to tell you that I will be joined by Derek Burks. Derek is a historical author who has written some fine novels set during the Wars of the Roses and also produces a truly excellent podcast called the Wars of the Roses Podcast. It comprises 46 episodes at the time of writing, although there are a few left to wrap up. The average length of each episode is only 15 to 20 minutes. So anyone discovering this now, and I hope I can point some of you at Derek's podcast, you can tear through it pretty smartish. I've been listening to Derek's wonderful delivery since near the beginning, and it's a great listen. He's a truly objective commentator delivering clear, understandable history with really good context and a gentle humour that's really entertaining. We're delighted to welcome Derek on board and grateful for his time. Now, there'll be links to both his podcast and his books, but I do want to say a word or two about the books. These follow the fortunes of the Elder family, starting off with the main character, Ned Elder, and they're caught up in the mayhem of the 15th century's internecine squabbles in England, and they are a cracking good read. I downloaded them onto my e-reader, Kindle in my case, but other e-readers are available, many months ago, but I hadn't got round to reading them because pretty much everything I've been reading for the last few months has been to do with research for the show. However, I got into them and now I just can't put them down. I'm into the third book of the initial run of 4, although there is another run of 4 that continues the examination of the Elder family's fortunes as the Wars of the Roses goes on. I really do recommend them. It's very much in the style of Con Eagledon or Bernard Cornwell, that kind of, where you have a fictional character really cleverly interwoven into the known historical facts. Okay, updates and errata. So the major update is that it's now 2020. So, Happy New Year, everybody. Yeah, I was going to download a clip of people shouting Happy New Year, but that was just really gimmicky, so I didn't. Who'd have thunk it when we started this 3 years ago with episode 1 Gladiator that we'd still be chugging away, entering our 4th year with a host of movies still to cover and more coming out. There's been quite a few recent releases that are historical films. Thanks to all of you who've downloaded, listened, and especially those who leave us reviews and write us emails. You can do so by writing to hosts@historybyhollywood.com or by visiting facebook.com/historybyhollywood or on Twitter, where we are at historybyhwood. We couldn't fit the whole word Hollywood, so it's the letter H and then wood. Or you can use the contact page on the website, which can be found at historybyhollywood.com. The home page is also the planned episodes page, and more of that in a moment. It is worth mentioning that we've had some feedback about the new format. Most of what we've heard is that whilst you understand our reasons, most who've expressed an opinion have said you'd prefer we stick to the previous method of putting out a full episode every fortnight. Sadly, to maintain what level of quality we've managed to achieve thus far, we simply had to ease up the research workload somehow. The only alternative we can see is that we research, record, edit and publish full episodes, and they'll just take as long as they take. The upside to this is you get a complete episode in one push. The downside is that the output will be irregular, and we really wanted to avoid that. I don't know if anyone who was with us at the start remembers the very first episodes, and we tried to put them out on a weekly basis. Well, that kitten was never going to get it in the litter tray every time. However, as episode 68 is a special one, it is going to be split over only 2 weeks, even though each half is going to go well over an hour. Part 2 has already been done with Derek, and that's nearly 2 hours. So we hope that you enjoy this effort. It seems fitting for this time of year, as I'm bulging at the seams, so why should the podcast be any different? Now, we do have a little bit, it's not really errata, more of an omission from our previous episode, The Insider. We did make mention of the remarkable man, Richard Scruggs, the ex-US Navy pilot and lawyer who weighed in to support Lowell Bergman and Jeffrey Wigand. Now, there's no doubt he was a remarkable man who did an awful lot of good. However, in the interest of balance, we should also mention that he was jailed in 2008 for attempting to bribe a judge, and he served 6 years in prison, which also ended his legal career. And in further omission errata, I couldn't remember who directed Cry Freedom, and it was, of course, Sir Richard Attenborough. Whoops. In news and reviews, we're delighted to have reached a decision on planned episodes, as posted on the planned episodes page of the website, which is also the homepage, as I mentioned earlier. After this 2-part episode, we will be covering Frost Nixon, for which Andrew is currently wading through numerous original interviews and documentaries, which I hear isn't quite as much as fun as one might think. After that, we will cover The Social Network, the story of Mark Zuckerberg and the rise of Facebook, or the genesis of Facebook. And for that, we'll have another guest host, an industry insider, so we're looking forward to that very much. The next episode after that, probably airing around the 23rd of February, depending on the length of the preceding shows, will be last year's movie Midway. It's been panned by critics, but audiences, and this is thousands of reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, are plumping it firmly in the 90s, so of percentages marks, that is. So again, we have this the divergence between critics' opinions and audiences. Following Midway, we're going to do 2016's Denial, which we'll mention again later in the intro, before we take on current popularity and review chart topping Ford and Ferrari, telling the story of the 1966 Le Mans race. By that time, we'll be well into March, if not the beginning of April. So more details about each of these movies are on the website's planned episodes page, and hopefully that gives you fair warning of what's coming up next for those of you who like to get ahead of the game and read ahead, as it were, by watching the movies. Now, we do have 2 new reviews, one from each side of the Atlantic. The first one we got was 5 stars on Apple Podcasts from Bagpuss from the United Kingdom, who posted on December the 30th, History by Hollywood or History versus Hollywood. It's great to see which wins in the battle between story and fact, in some of the best and least known films in the world. The passion and integrity of these 2 gents is inspiring. I look forward to the less accurate films just as much as the nearly documentary accurate ones. I've been compiling my own to-be-watched list for the films covered in this podcast. Some I would never even think of watching. The latest to hit the list is The Insider. I'd never even heard of it. Even reviewing the film The Imitation Game would be great to get the view of the film and to discuss the actual history, even if the only things that they got right are there was a war and there was a guy named Alan. But I understand if you review this film, you might as well review The Lord of the Rings, not really in your ballpark. If you ever do decide to do reviews of other films, the good, the bad and the unknown, I'd listen to that too, so engaging in your personalities. Oh, I'm blushing. Thank you, Mr. Bagpuss. He goes on. Looking forward to your thoughts on the latest batch of war films, Midway, 1917 and D-Day. Even though I'm not sure these are supposed to be accurate or not, and as for the format, if people want shorter but more frequent episodes, then please carry on. I prefer the longer ones, but it's okay. I just save up the episodes until I have a full film review, then listen to them back to back. But whichever way you want to do them, just please keep doing them. 5 hearts as well as 5 stars. Bagpuss, thank you so much. That is truly heartwarming. It really is. Midway, as you've heard, we are putting out. That's going to be out in a few episodes' time. 1917 looks really good. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I'm going to hopefully go and see it in a 4D cinema. So expect to be splattered with mud and maybe shot a couple of times. But it's only just on cinema release now, so we're going to have to give it a bit of time. D-Day, I have to look up. I wasn't aware there was a new D-Day movie, so I'm going to chase that down. Now, I know there is one about, I think it's D-Day, which has something to do with zombies. So I'm not sure that's really going to fall into our remit, but thank you very much indeed. Then we got Spot On from Luke in Virginia, from the USA, who on Boxing Day took the time and trouble to write in and say, thoroughly enjoying the podcast. Audiences are often introduced to historical events through dramatised motion pictures, resulting in a general misunderstanding of the actual facts. Martin and Andrew are setting the record straight by carefully deconstructing films based on and inspired by true or historical events, whilst maintaining a respectful stance pertaining to the realities and art of filmmaking. It has been a pleasure listening, and the podcast has reinvigorated interest in forgotten topics and films. Keep up the good work. P.S. Oliver Stone's JFK. To which my immediate response is, Luke, that's another absolutely delightful review. Thank you so much. JFK, not on your Nelly. That is a can of worms that would get into the litter tray, eat up all the litter, and devour a few kittens for good measure. There's probably too many rabbit holes down there. And I have to say, and for those who've seen Oliver Stone's JFK, they might get what I mean. I think that film has a massive cop-out at the end when they have Mr. X turns up, the wonderful Donald Sutherland, who I watch all day, but his character just sort of kind of says, yeah, it was a conspiracy and it was everyone. You're like, okay. Anyway, in listener feedback, we've had a number of emails since we last ran an intro, and I am aware this is already a lengthy intro, so I'm going to mention each one, and some will get a little bit more attention than others. So if we don't read yours out in full, I do apologise. I'm pretty sure we've managed to reply to everybody's emails, and we will continue to do so. But the level of correspondence is growing as the audience grows, thankfully at a steady rate. It's not swamping us yet. We do promise to reply to every email, although in one or two cases I was a little bit slow over the festive season getting back to people. But reading them out, we did have an email from John Gibbs, a listener who's followed me across from Motopod, the motorcycle racing podcast I used to co-host. He wrote some lovely words telling us that through HBH, he and his family have enjoyed a number of movies they might not have otherwise seen. So very much echoing the sentiments of Bagpuss. And certainly, as we've mentioned a number of times, Andrew and I have watched films we wouldn't have otherwise watched. I don't think I'd have ever tracked down The Insider. And, okay, am I going to mention Hidden Figures again? No, I won't. Okay. So, John said, he was quite impressed. He said, listeners can impress their family and friends by pointing out what's true and what isn't if they've already listened to the podcast episode. John suggested Blue Max, which I recall being a World War I flying drama, but I can't recall much more than that, so I'll need to take a look. The Big Red One, which is certainly a very well thought of film. I think that's about the US 1st Infantry Division in World War II, and it's certainly got a very good reputation. And he also mentioned Ford versus Ferrari, which we will be covering. I think that's the last one we'll be doing in the run of announced movies that I've just made. We also heard from good friend and regular donator Gary Shavit. He offered up Two Popes, which I hadn't heard about, but that looks like another possible for us. It's Anthony Hopkins and Jonathan Pryce, starring as Anthony Hopkins as the incumbent Pope and Jonathan Pryce as a senior cardinal, who basically goes and says, look, I can't carry on with this. We're living in a medieval world and the real world's moved on. And he's clearly a reformer. And he tries to offer his resignation and instead is told, no, you're going to be the next Pope. And this is actually, I believe, the Pope who is currently in the seat. Now, when I saw the title and saw a photograph of the two of them in their cardinal or their official robes, I assumed this was talking about when, in medieval times, we had two popes. There was one in Rome and one in Avignon. So, or the Pope and the anti-Pope, depending which side of that particular fence you sat on. But no, this is incredibly modern. I'm not sure if it's one we will do. We'll need to have a look at it, and I certainly intend to watch it because it looks like a good film. We also heard from Nick Parkinson, Christina Dockstader and Phil Pomerantz, and the latter made a very generous donation to the cause, so thank you very much, Dr. Phil. In fact, thank you all. And just before we went to air with the intro here, we heard from listener Elizabeth Booth, who I suspect is a newish listener. She's listening on Catch Up. She's reached Schindler's List and wrote to say some very nice things and requested that we cover Denial, the 2016 courtroom drama, which covers the legal battle between historian Deborah Lipstadt and historical author or amateur historian and Holocaust denier David Irving. Now, as you'll have already heard, we have included Denial in the upcoming show list, so thank you to Elizabeth and the other listeners who have previously recommended it. I did have a search through archived emails, but I couldn't actually find the names of those of you who have suggested Denial in the past. Now, it doesn't rate that highly with audiences, and I suspect this might be because it might be a bit dry. I haven't watched it yet. And yet I've read reviews of it that say it is actually a really compelling and gripping courtroom drama. So we will do it. We'll have a look at it. And I do think it's worth highlighting the fact that there are some apparently intelligent and educated people who are still buying the sort of crap that David Irving was peddling. Oh, and by the way, Mr. Irving, if you want to sue me for saying you're full of crap, fill your boots, because I've got precedent on my side. So, for this episode, we're going to cover Henry V from the story of the movie through an abbreviated synopsis and a more comprehensive reality check, where we'll look at how faithfully the movie and therefore the original play reflect the real events as far as we know them. Once we're complete with Henry V, we'll cover the Richard III, and we'll also start that with the story of the movie, but there'll be a very brief intro. So if you do write to us between the sort of 8th, 9th of January and the, the 20th or so, I'm afraid your acknowledgement of that email will come out at the next episode in Frost Nixon. Our sources, we should mention, apart from Shakespeare for the synopsis side, the plays and the movies, we've used some books, many articles, podcast episodes, TV documentaries, along with, especially for the Richard part of the show, Derek Burke's wonderful Wars of the Roses podcast. Now, one other question on sources that I did feel we needed to address was, what sources did Shakespeare use? Now, primarily, he seems to have used Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, which are recognised as the first comprehensive history of England, Scotland and Ireland written as a chronological narrative. Holinshed died in 1580, so he was relatively contemporary to Shakespeare, who was born in 1564. Shakespeare is also known to have drawn on Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York, specifically about the Wars of the Roses. In his research for Richard III, he also seems to have used Thomas More's, this is of A Man for All Seasons fame, Thomas More's History of Richard III, written between around 1513 to 1518, although Holinshed also used this source, so Shakespeare may have been using second-hand information, possibly unwittingly. Thomas More was one of the first historians who went beyond known facts. He dramatised events and gave motives and thoughts to the protagonist, and it's fair to say he was no fan of Richard's. He clearly believed that Richard was directly responsible for the, spoiler alert, murder of the princes in the Tower. Now, we do get ahead of ourselves a little bit with that, but it's worth bearing in mind that Thomas More was writing at a time when he was Chancellor to Henry VIII, whose dad was the mortal enemy of Richard III. So this may have coloured or flavoured his writings. Or he may have genuinely believed that Richard III was a horrible person, and we will be looking at that in company of Derek in a week's time. However, for now, it's Henry V, the Battle of Agincourt, and on with the show. As ever, we'll start off with the story of the movie. Clearly based on Shakespeare's play Henry V, Kenneth Branagh, like Olivier with Richard III, adapted the play to the screen, directed the movie, and played the title role. The movie was produced by the BBC and Renaissance Films, Branagh's own production company, and was mainly shot in studios in the UK, with the outdoor scenes being mainly shot in fields and woods adjacent to the studios, part of the reason that costs were kept right down. Incredibly, for 1989, it only cost $9 million to make, and it made $10.2 million at the worldwide box office. So it made its money back with a margin of profit, at least enough left over for a slap-up meal for the cast and crew, even if it wasn't a roaring financial success. Starring many names from British theatre and film, these include Dame Judi Dench, and I've actually written in the notes, this is a name I have historically and hysterically struggled to say when the honorific is included, and there you have a perfect example. I genuinely find it really difficult to say Dame Judi Dench. Jane Doody Wench, I think, is my most common way of saying it. Wonderful actress. We must also mention, especially after Simon Barr's wonderful review and email last time out requesting A Man for All Seasons, the actor Paul Schofield. The reason I link it to A Man for All Seasons is he played the title role, not the title role, sorry, but the main role of Sir Thomas More in that movie. Here he plays the French King Charles VI, and although his name is less known outside British theatre, as he was far happier performing Shakespeare on stage than appearing in cinema, a more magnetising stage or screen presence is hard to imagine. I was reading up on Paul Schofield, and it struck me that he was born in 1942, was married at the age of 20 to Joy Parker. They had 2 children. Now, he died in 2008, still happily married to Joy, who followed him off this mortal coil in 2012. In a late interview, asked how he would like to be remembered, Paul once answered, "If you have a family, that is the best way to be remembered." And we will cover A Man for All Seasons very soon, we promise. The score was composed by Patrick Doyle, and it was his first film score. A classically trained composer, Doyle would go on to score another 11 Branagh films, very much becoming the John Williams to Branagh's Steven Spielberg. His song Non Nobis Domine, heard in the outro of The Insider last week, and no doubt to be heard again, won an Ivor Novello Award, and Doyle himself appears as the first soldier to start singing on the battlefield in the aftermath of Agincourt. The movie was nominated for 3 Academy Awards, Kenneth Branagh for Best Actor and Best Director, neither of which he won, but Phyllis Dalton did win Best Costume Design. At the BAFTAs, Branagh won Best Director. On Rotten Tomatoes, the movie scores a very rare 100% from critics and 89% from audiences. Interestingly, Laurence Olivier's 1940s version gets 100% from critics, but only 79% from audiences. Partly this may be due to Branagh's Shakespearean English being a tad more comprehensible to mere mortals than Olivier's, more of which later. Both movie versions, like nearly all Shakespeare productions, whether film or theatre, adapt the play to a degree, leaving out some scenes, chopping others around a little bit, and in the case of some, adding scenes from earlier plays set to provide a degree of context. Richard III does this, and in Branagh's Henry V, he uses flashbacks to Henry IV to show Prince Hal in his youth. So, Henry V, the reality check and the synopsis. In the opening scene, we see a character called Chorus. Now, this is a character that Shakespeare uses in a few plays. It's essentially a narrator. He's going to introduce each scene and make some explanations to us, the audience, in certain areas. In this film, he's played by the wonderful Derek Jacobi. He turns on theatre lights and he's walking around the backstage of a modern theatre surrounded by props, lights, scenery boards, and he appeals to us to use our imaginations to picture the scenes described as he apologises for our unworthy scaffold, the theatre. He describes young King Henry, at whose feet crouch the dogs of war, seeking employment. We enter the first scene proper to see the Archbishop of Canterbury debating with one of his colleagues a new law proposed which will strip much profit from the church. They decide to support Henry's claim to the throne of France in the hope it will turn the young king away from the proposed law. Next we see Henry's court, where several nobles await the king's arrival, and this is where we first meet our main character, played by Kenneth Branagh. He takes his seat and asks for the Archbishop, my gracious Lord of Canterbury. The Archbishop arrives and gives a lengthy explanation of why Henry's claim to the French throne is just, repudiating the French so-called Salic law. Now, this law forbade inheritance through the female line, and the Archbishop goes on to describe how actually the French kings are descended from the female line themselves, and anyway it's irrelevant because the Salic law doesn't apply to France, but an area that he says is actually part of Germany. We meet the Duke of Exeter, played by Brian Blessed, and Earl Westmoreland, and these are both relatives, an uncle and a cousin, I think, of the king. They urge him to challenge the French, and Henry asks for the messengers from the Dauphin. Montjoy, a French herald, played by Christopher Ravenscroft, arrives and announces a challenge from the Dauphin, who is the French prince and heir to the throne. And we've got an opening clip.
Now are we well prepared to know the pleasure of our fair cousin Dauphin.
Your Highness, lately sending into France, did claim some certain dukedoms in the right of your great predecessor, King Edward III. In answer of which claim, the prince, my master, says that you savor too much of your youth. He therefore sends you, meter for your spirit, this ton of treasure. And in lieu of this, desires you let those dukedoms that you claim hear no more of you. This the Dauphin speaks.
What treasure, uncle?
Tennis balls, my liege.
We are glad the Dauphin is so pleasant with us. His present and your pains we thank you for. When we have matched our rackets to these balls, we will in France, by God's grace, play a set. Shall strike his father's crown into the hazard, and we understand him well. How he comes o'er us with our wilder days, not measuring what use we made of them. But tell the Dauphin, I will keep my state, be like a king, and show my sail of greatness when I do rouse me in my throne of France. And tell the pleasant prince, this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones, and his soul shall stand sore charged for the wasteful vengeance that shall fly with them. For many a thousand widows shall this his mock out of their dear husbands, mock mothers from their sons, mock castles down, and some are yet ungotten and unborn that shall have cause to curse the Dauphin's scorn. So get you hence in peace, and tell the Dauphin his jest will savour but of shallow wit, when thousands weep more than did laugh at it.
So there we see the young king. He's not going to be intimidated. He's certainly not going to accept being mocked. Before we go on, we'll just set the scene in reality. Henry V's father, Henry IV, had been Henry Bolingbroke. He was a son of John of Gaunt, who was a younger son of King Edward III, and so Henry Bolingbroke himself was a grandson of King Edward III. King Edward's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince of Wales, had died before his father, so the throne went to King Edward's grandson, Richard, the son of the Black Prince. He was close with his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, but Richard proved to be an ineffectual king, so cousin Henry went into rebellion against him, usurped the crown, and imprisoned Richard, and subsequently, it would appear, had him murdered. So young King Henry, Henry V, is the son of a usurper who, according to Shakespeare, once advised his son and heir to dizzy English minds with foreign quarrels. In other words, if things aren't going well at home, distract and unite your people by giving them a common enemy, and you can do this by attacking another country. Advice that has been followed by many a leader of many countries since. As far as the present of tennis balls goes, they did exist, so did the game, and it was well established by this period, but there are no records of the Dauphin sending an insulting message implying Henry was a callow youth who should spend his time playing. Aged 16, he fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury with his father against the Welsh rebel Owen Glendower, and he was hit just below his eye by an arrow. Clearly he survived this, and he fought on, although it did leave a significant scar. By the time of Agincourt, Henry was still only 29. The specifics of the Salic law, the King Edward III, Henry's great-grandfather, he was a nephew to the recently deceased French king, but through his sister, whereas the French court chose a cousin who was related through a male relative. The Archbishop had gone back in time and said, no, eventually they're all descended through the female line. So, back to the movie. We meet Chorus again, and he tells us that the youth of England are on fire. And then we cut to a rough boarding house where we meet old soldiers Lieutenant Bardolph and Corporal Nym and Pistol. We also meet Mistress Quickly, played by Judi Dench, but from a historical perspective, there's not much to be gained for us going through these scenes in great detail. So in the interests of keeping this as short as possible, these are drinking buddies and old soldier comrades of Commander Falstaff, Jack Falstaff. And those familiar with Shakespeare's plays will recognise the character. He's a fictitious character loosely based on certain knights of the era. Hard drinking, womanising, good at fighting, but Falstaff is in his elder years now, and he's quite poorly. Interestingly, from the perspective of this period, according to Shakespeare, these were drinking buddies of young Prince Hal, who has now been crowned as Henry V. And it's used as a device for us to see how this so-called rabble-rousing young feckless prince has actually grown up and taken on the duties of kingship. We see a flashback where Falstaff begs the young Prince Hal not to banish him when he becomes king, but the prince looks at him with a fairly steely glaze and says, "Oh, I will." This ends this scene, and we're going to cut back to the leaders and the king. But first of all, we hear Chorus talking to us of treason.
The French, advised by good intelligence of this most dreadful preparation, shake in their fear, and with pale policy seek to divert the English purposes. O England, model to thy inward greatness, like little body with a mighty heart. What mightst thou do that honor would thee do, were all thy children kind and natural? But see, thy fault France hath in thee found out, a nest of hollow bosoms, which he fills with treacherous crowns, and 3 corrupted men, one Richard Earl of Cambridge, and the second Henry Lord Scroop of Masham, and the third Sir Thomas Grey, Knight of Northumberland, have for the guilt of France, oh, guilt indeed, confirmed conspiracy with fearful France, and by their hands this grace of kings must die ere he take ship for France. The traitors are agreed. The king is set from London, and the scene is now transported, gentles, to Southampton.
So, as we said, the portrayals and scenes of the old soldiers are wholesale fiction. But it does indicate how Henry grows up and becomes aware of his responsibilities, that duty is all, even to the exclusion of old friendships. The Southampton treason is thought to have really happened, and what it involved was a distant cousin of Henry's, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. The plan was of the conspirators to place him on the throne after a planned assassination of Henry. The leader of the conspirators is thought to be Richard Earl of Cambridge, joined by Henry Lord Scroop of Masham and Sir Thomas Grey. Sadly for these 3, Sir Edmund Mortimer, the Earl of March, who they sought to place on the throne probably as a puppet king, revealed the plot to the king himself, thereby saving his own life. Lord Scroop was a particularly painful revelation to Henry, because he'd been a close advisor and treasurer to the king, but as we said, the leader seems to have been Richard Earl of Cambridge. He was yet another grandson of King Edward III through one of his younger sons, and despite having been given the title of the Earl of Cambridge after marrying Lady Anne Mortimer, he wasn't given any lands with the title, and he seems to have been in some financial trouble. Only Shakespeare seems to suggest that they were bought with French gold. Modern scholars seem to think it was more a plot to put their puppet, the Earl of March, on the throne, through whom they could then enrich themselves. And in a quirky twist of connections, Richard of Cambridge and Anne Mortimer would have a son. In fact, they already have a son at this stage, which is handy, because Richard Earl of Cambridge is about to have his head chopped off. Their son, also called Richard, would rise to become the Duke of York, and he would then have 3 sons of his own. Edward, who became Edward IV, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who went on to become Richard III, and we'll be examining that in more detail in the second half of this episode. So clearly ambition ran through their veins, and you have to say that Richard, Duke of York, Edward IV and Richard III's father, he did quite well to rise to that level, considering he was son of a traitor. So back to the movie, we see Henry and the Duke of Exeter with some of his other knights, and they're clearly aware of the treason. Henry invites the 3 traitors in, having not yet revealed the fact that he knows about their plot, and he asks for some general advice in how they should deal with a man who's been arrested for railing against the royal person. In other words, this guy, probably drunk, has been in the street saying, Henry's an idiot. Henry's inclined towards mercy, but the 3 conspirators say to him, "No, your majesty, you should punish him. If you give him life, then you show mercy, but after the taste of much correction." He pauses and says, well, the thing is, he said, if I should be harsh against the man who just railed against my person through drink, how shall I raise my eye when capital crimes are discovered? In other words, you might want to be careful about telling me to be harsh. He hands the 3 conspirators letters, supposedly royal warrants, but actually they contain evidence of their treason, because when they open them and read them, all of them suddenly look shocked, and they beg for mercy. However, Henry is firm. The 3 men try to resist, but they're overpowered and disarmed, and immediately sentenced to death. Meanwhile, Bardolph, Pistol, Nym, and Boy, played by Christian Bale, a very, very young Christian Bale, take their leave of Mistress quickly as they depart to join the army. Commander Falstaff has died, and they share a few thoughts about their memories of him. The reality, the unmasking of the conspirators almost certainly didn't quite play out the way Shakespeare and Branagh would have us believe, but they were caught, accused, tried, and local legend tells us that this trial was held in the Red Lion Coaching Inn in Southampton, these days a pub where you can still enjoy a pint today. A few days later, they were executed. Back to the movie, we're shown a map. It's a very clever device. It's a paper map, and we see a line appear as we travel down to Rouen, where Charles VI of France, played by Paul Schofield, discusses the English invasion with his nobles. We meet the Dauphin, a cocky and aggressive young prince, and older French nobles share glances as the Dauphin speaks. Clearly they're not fans of him. They're generally led by Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and he warns the Dauphin not to underestimate King Henry. King Charles reminds them that Henry is born of that bloody strain that haunted us in our familiar past. The Herald Montjoy announces the arrival of English ambassadors, and the Dauphin urges his father to defiance. And we now see the Duke of Exeter, played by the very large and very loud Brian Blessed, arrive in full armour, sent as an ambassador by Henry. And we have a clip. It's not so much a message as a threat.
From our brother, England?
From him, and thus he greets your majesty. He wills you, in the name of God Almighty, that you divest yourself and lay apart the borrowed glories that by gift of heaven, by law of nature and of nations, longs to him and to his heirs, namely, the crown. Willing you overlook this pedigree, and when you find him evenly derived from his most famed of famous ancestors, Edward III, he bids you then resign your crown and kingdom, indirectly held from him, the native and true challenger.
Or else, what follows?
Bloody constraint. For if you hide the crown, even in your hearts, there will he rake for it, Therefore, in fierce tempest is he coming, in thunder and in earthquake, like a Jove, that if requiring fail, he will compel. This is his claim, his threatening, and my message. Unless the dolphin be in presence here, to whom expressly I bring greeting too.
For the Dauphin, I stand here for him. What to him from England?
Scorn and defiance, slight regard, contempt, and anything that might not misbecome the mighty sender. Doth he prize you, aunt? Thus says my king.
Say, if my father render fair return, it is against my will, for I desire nothing but odds with England. And to that end, as matching to his youth and vanity, I did present him with the Paris balls.
You make your Paris Louvre shake for it. And be assured, you'll find a difference, as we his subjects have in wonder found, between the promise of his greener days and these he masters now.
Tomorrow shall you know our mind at full.
So the reality, going back to the previous chorus clip where he talked about treason, he said the French quake in their fear. The portrayal of the French is very much skewed to an English perspective, understandably, I suppose, given the time and who was writing it. Shakespeare, though, appears torn between wanting to show them as arrogant, boastful and proud, and yet at the same time fearful of the gallant English, a trick he manages to pull off reasonably effectively. We meet the Dauphin, who will feature prominently throughout the play, yet in reality this Dauphin, this is the title held by the heir to the French throne, similar to Britain's Prince of Wales. This was an 18-year-old youth who was famously fat and indolent. His day, one historian I heard say, consisted of rising around 4 in the afternoon and then spending his waking hours eating fine food and drinking large quantities of wine. Early in the campaign, Henry challenged him to single combat to decide the outcome of the invasion, but this was never seriously expected to lead to anything. Rather, it was to highlight the unmilitary bearing of the French prince, particularly compared to the combative English king. This Dauphin was Louis, the 8th of Charles VI's 12 children, many of whom would die young. Charles himself, the French king, suffered periodic episodes of insanity, during which he believed himself to be made of glass and demanded to be wrapped in barrel hoops in case he got broken. Also, during many of these periods, he insisted that his name was George and he wouldn't answer to any other name or title. So, maybe not the most effective leader to have at a time of crisis. So France was effectively being run by a group of nobles, predictably proud, egotistical, and jealous of perceived slights or favours given to others. France was in fact in a state of near civil war, the king's madness combining with powerful nobles vying for influence and regency to lead to near conflict. His nephew Charles, the Duke of Orleans, led one faction, against whom was pitted John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy. This rivalry and sometime outright war would continue beyond our scope here and eventually lead to the Burgundians becoming allied to the English. So back to the play. The scene shifts to Harfleur, where a siege is in progress. Chorus again tells us that the French king offered his daughter Catherine and some petty and unprofitable dukedoms. The offer liked him not. In other words, King Henry was not impressed. It's a night scene and there's explosions and cannon firing at the castle walls, and the king urges his men, "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more," the first of several famous speeches from this play. He praises his men but also challenges them, and at the end of the speech he orders them to, upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England and St. George. Bardolph, Nym and Pistol cheer with the rest of them very enthusiastically and then are noticeably slow in moving forward. In fact, they try and turn around and skulk away, but they're confronted by Captain Llewellyn, played by Ian Holm. He's a Welsh officer. He turns them around and sends them back into the breach. Meanwhile, Llewellyn is joined by Davy Gower, an Englishman, then there's Captain Jamie, a Scotsman, and an Irishman, played by John Sessions, and they're discussing the mines under the town's walls. We see the army retreating from the walls again, but now Henry addresses the town's leaders up on their wall. His threats against them are really brutal, threatening their wives and their children. It's quite bloodthirsty. His offer is that if they surrender, he will spare the town from sacking, but if they continue to resist, he will unleash his army upon their town and its inhabitants. The town leader calls down that they had asked the Dauphin to come to relieve them, but he is unable to do so, and so they surrender. Henry orders his uncle, the Duke of Exeter, to fortify the town, but to use mercy on the townsfolk. He says he will take the army and retire to Calais, the implication being that Exeter will remain in the town as its commander. The reality is this is actually pretty accurate. The siege of Harfleur lasted 6 weeks, during which Henry deployed artillery against the town's defences. He's said to have been an avid student of gunpowder weapons that were very much in their infancy at this stage, and he experimented with their positioning and use, possibly choosing as strong a town as Harfleur for this very purpose. Siege warfare in Europe at this stage was generally conducted under the biblical law of Deuteronomy. What this said was if a town surrendered, they could expect mercy and leniency. However, if they resisted to the point that they were taken by storm, their lives and property were forfeit. After repeatedly refusing to surrender, they asked Henry for a final extension as they requested relief from the French army. And this is quite common. You hear about this in medieval times quite often. They'll say to a besieging army, look, we've said to the French king or to whoever their overlords were, come and relieve us. Can you come within 10 days or 3 weeks or 5 days or whatever it may be? And they'll say to the besieging commander, if they haven't arrived, fine, we'll surrender. Is that okay? So it was fairly civilised in terms that there were negotiations. So the Duke of Exeter stays to fortify the town, but actually there's a bit of an error here by Shakespeare. Thomas Beaufort was his name, and he was actually the Earl of Dorset at this stage. He wouldn't become the Duke of Exeter in the following year. To save confusion, we'll continue to refer to him as Exeter. He was another of Henry's uncles, and he was given the task of defending Harfleur along with over 1,000 of Henry's men. Dysentery had struck both the besiegers and the besieged townsfolk, leading Henry to lose, or we're not clear if they died, but some 2,000 men were lost from the army. Many may have been repatriated to England to recover. Numbers are always difficult to pin down at these times, not only due to the scarcity of reliable records, but also an element of propaganda put about by both sides. But it seems fair to assess Henry's remaining army, which undertook the next phase, as somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000. Historians differ, but this seems to be the average that I've been able to discover. Just another quick point on names. It can be ever so confusing because people, nobles, the important folk, or certainly how they saw themselves, are generally referred to by their titles. But of course, when one holder of that title dies, another holder inherits it, often a family member, but sometimes not. Or if someone is in rebellion against the king and then they're beaten, they're stripped of their titles, they're given to someone else. So you'll still have a Duke of Exeter, it just might be a different actual person. Thankfully, apart from one notable difference, which we'll come to shortly in the body of the Dauphin, most of the names that we'll be using do actually remain the same person. Back to the movie. We now meet Princess Catherine, daughter of King Charles of France. She's played by Emma Thompson, and we see her talking in French with her maid as she tries to practice English, obviously having been informed that she's been offered to the English king as a possible bride, even though Henry has rejected that offer. They burst into giggles when they get to the English word for foot, as it closely resembles a rude word in French. We see King Charles looking despairing as he hears reports that the English have crossed the River Somme. Constable d'Albret urges him alongside the Dauphin to take action, and King Charles finally orders his army out into the field. D'Albret sounds very confident, regretting that there are so few English for him to beat. However, the Dauphin is horrified to be told by his father that he is not to accompany the army. He shall remain with the king in Rouen. We see the English army marching through the rain, and the hand-drawn map reappears, and we see their progress crawling across the map. They finally arrive near a town called Agincourt on the map. Wading through rivers and mud, the soaked army looked pretty miserable. The rain finally stops when an exhausted Llewellyn is on his way to meet the king and to inform him that the Duke of Exeter is holding a bridge ready for the army to cross. Before Llewellyn can get to the king, he's approached by Pistol, who begs Llewellyn to use his influence with the king to seek mercy for Bardolph, who's been arrested for stealing from a church. Llewellyn rejects his plea, and the king arrives, and Llewellyn gives Henry his report about the bridges. We then see the Duke of Exeter arrive riding on a carriage or a cart. A dejected-looking Bardolph is also in the cart, and Exeter has a noose in his hand. The old soldier looks imploringly at Henry, but he simply nods to Exeter, who fits the noose over his neck, and we see a young Hal in flashback again, applauding Bardolph in some previous time as he's competing in some drinking game. Bardolph is hanged, kicking and twitching, and again we see this steely resolve in the young king, but we also see a tear slide down his cheek. So it's a way of showing us, yes, he's got resolve, but he's also human. He reminds his men that anything they take from the locals must be paid for. As they stare at the hanging body, Montjoy, the French herald, arrives. He's defiant and tells King Henry he must offer a ransom to avoid being destroyed along with his army. Henry calmly tells Montjoy that he would be willing to march on to Calais without interference from the French, but his only ransom is his tired and worthless body, and if the French king wants him, he knows where to find him. So the reality there, the scenes of Princess Catherine are like those of the old soldiers earlier, fictional, although she was a real person and she would go on to marry Henry later. The French indecision seems to be fairly accurate. They had several choices, maybe too many, but what is clear is the wisest strategy for them to follow would be a Fabian strategy, namely to avoid pitched battle for as long as possible, and that was clearly in their interest as the English army would become ever more hungry, bedraggled and tired. However, the French nobles, looking at the size of the English army, would have probably felt that this would be a snub to their pride, and they urged an aggressive stance. Initially, wiser heads seem to have prevailed. One thing they did do is retrieve what was known as the oriflamme from its safekeeping in the monastery at Saint-Denis. This was a sacred battle flag. It was either blood red or orange red in colour, and it was said to have been made for the Emperor Charlemagne. When raised in battle, it was said to mean no quarter would be given until it was lowered. However, when we say the oriflamme, there had to be several made because they did keep losing it in battle. They lost it at least 5 times, including against the English at Crécy and Poitiers and, spoiler alert, Agincourt. For a knight to be tasked with carrying it was a great honour, and he of course was expected to die rather than surrender it. It had a name as well as the oriflamme was like its title, but originally its name was Romain, but later it became Montjoy, which may have given Shakespeare the idea for naming the French herald for this play. The scene with Bardolph is again a device Shakespeare uses to show that Henry is determined to be a proper king, observing proper laws and not favouring anyone to the detriment of what we used to call in the British Army good military order and discipline. Yet the tear we see trickling down his cheek shows that he hasn't lost his humanity, simply that he's able to suppress it when needed. And as mentioned earlier, the Duke of Exeter, or actually the Earl of Dorset at this time, he was still captain of Harfleur and he took no part in the battle at Agincourt. But maybe Kenneth Branagh was too scared to tell Brian Blessed he couldn't join in the fight. Back to the movie. Chorus returns to introduce the eve of the coming battle. He tells us that 2 armies await the next day as the armourers prepare for the fight, closing up armour and sharpening swords. The French are confident, and we see the assembled French nobles boast about the quality of their armour, the strength of their army, what deeds they're going to carry out the next day. And surprisingly, considering he was told to remain with his father, the Dauphin is there too, boasting along with the best of them. Although that's a very short snippet of synopsis, we will give a quick reality check. The French army had harried the English all the way on their long march, or chevauchée, towards Calais. A chevauchée was either a reconnaissance in force or a fast cavalry ride designed to disrupt enemy forces by destroying food supplies and convoys in their rear area, or, as in this case, pretty much thumbing your nose at your enemy saying, "I can ride through your country and you can't stop me, nah, 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 nah." The only thing is, the English were in a pretty bad way by now. Some historians have said, yeah, they're not quite as bedraggled as Shakespeare would have us believe, but they've been on a hard march, they've been harried, and as Henry says to Montjoy, they're keen to get back to Calais. However, it was in both armies' interest to have a battle, provided it led to victory. Imagine if Henry had been allowed to just return to Calais and then England with only Harfleur to show for his efforts. The French could argue that they'd chased him out. So he almost certainly wanted a fight. As for the French, Henry was thumbing his nose at them, or they worried that that is how it could be portrayed. So they desperately wanted to beat him and, if possible, kill or capture him. However, they certainly didn't underestimate him, so they didn't have the option of capture and release as they'd done before, notably to King John, that King John, bad King John, where they'd repeatedly capture him because he wasn't a very good war leader, and then just let him go. Probably along the lines of, yeah, you actually help us more by commanding your own armies than you would in a French prison. You wonder how many times this must happen before John starts to think, I don't think they take me very seriously. Anyway, back to the movie. Chorus tells us that the poor condemned English sit patiently by their fires. The scene then switches to the damp English army sat around fires as Chorus tells us that Henry walks among the men. He wishes them well, calling them brothers and friends, and thawing cold fear, so that mean and gentle all may behold a little touch of Harry in the night, which is a lovely phrase. Henry borrows a cloak from one of his nobles and goes amongst the men incognito to divine their real mood. He meets Pistol, who challenges him, and they have a quick discussion, and then he sits down with another group of men and they talk about their consciences and their souls. One of the men says, I have a clear conscience. If the king's cause is true, we will fight for him. But if the cause be unjust, even though we'll still fight, our obedience to him wipes our sins clean, and all the responsibility lies with the king. Henry retorts that the king cannot be held responsible for the souls of all his men. Some of them have their own sins that are nothing to do with the king. It looks like an argument's about to break out, but Llewellyn and Gower arrive and the men run off. It's an interesting point that. I'm just going to quickly jump not so much into a reality, but Shakespeare really gets into the philosophy there of does obedience to your lord, or in this case your king, wipe you clean of any responsibility if that king's cause is unjust, or if the king is behaving badly. And it kind of leads into the discussions that came out and led to the Geneva Convention, stating after the Second World War that every individual service person is responsible for their own actions. So if you're given an illegal order, it is your duty to refuse it. So yeah, really interesting that even this early people were thinking about morality and ethics. Henry sits amongst his sleeping men. He talks to himself and he worries about this very point, the responsibility and the causes. He almost wishes he was a simple soldier with nothing to worry about but the fight and their duty, whereas he, as king, has to carry the weight of the whole army. He ends pleading with God to help him on the following day. So the reality, the scenes with Henry walking amongst his men may well have some truth in it. He almost certainly didn't disguise himself and hope they didn't notice to whom they were speaking, but he does seem to have been a real soldier, that he understood how to get the best out of men at all levels of society. He may also have overheard his men talking when they were unaware he was in earshot. But either way, We do know that he spoke English, his father Henry IV having been the first English monarch to do so rather than primarily in French. Now, just to revisit our conversation about numbers, the Shakespearean take on it, the English were around 12,000 strong, with the French at 60,000. Both these figures are undoubtedly exaggerated. Modern historians differ quite wildly on the numbers. I mean, during my research, I've heard numbers for the English varying from 6,000 to 12,000 for the English and somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000 for the French. So you have some historians claiming that the French may have had a smaller army. Now, this may be based on the elements of the French army that actually engaged at Agincourt, because they didn't use reasonably large parts of their army, which would prove rather unfortunate for the French. I think generally the consensus seems to be that the English numbers are reasonably accurate, slightly exaggerated by Shakespeare, so we're probably looking at about 6,000 to 8,000. The French army is much harder to accurately assess, largely because we do have English records of pay and provisions required, whereas the French was not quite as well organised at this stage. It's very unlikely they had more than 20,000. It was probably more like 12 to 15. So probably about an odds of about 2 to 1. So back to the play or the movie, and the French arrive on the battlefield still boasting at how easily they're going to win the day. We see English soldiers sharpening stakes which are planted in the ground to form a defensive line. The Earl of Westmoreland and other English nobles worry about the French numbers, and again we hear this 60,000 French against the English 12,000. Westmoreland wishes for just another 10,000 Englishmen who today in England do no work. But Henry has just returned from viewing the French army, and he hears Westmoreland's complaint. Now, I know we've heard bits of this speech before, but this is one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, probably right up there with Friends, Romans, Countrymen. And I think to hear it in context, you do need to hear the whole lead up and also the denouement. After he finishes the speech, you'll hear the French herald Montjoy return and yet again demand ransom. So it's quite a long clip, but hopefully you'll enjoy it.
Of fighting men, they have full 70,000.
That's 5 to 1. Besides, they are all fresh.
Tis a fearful odds.
Oh, that we now had here but 10,000 of those men in England that do no work today.
What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that thought with us upon St. Crispin's Day!
My sovereign lord, bestow yourself with speed. The French are bravely in their battle set, and will with all expedients march upon us.
All things are ready if our minds be so.
Perish the man whose mind is backward now.
Thou dost not wish more help from England, coz?
God's will, my liege. Would you and I alone, without more help, could fight this royal battle?
You know your places! God be with you all!
Once more I come to know of thee, King Harry, if for thy ransom thou wilt now compound, before thy most assured overthrow.
Who hath sent thee now?
The Constable of France.
I pray thee bear my former answer back. Bid them achieve me, and then sell my bones. God! God! Why should they mock poor fellows thus? Let me speak proudly. Tell the constable, we are but warriors for the working day. Our gayness and our guilt are all besmirched with rainy marching in the painful field. But by the mass, our hearts are in the trim. Herald, save thou thy labour. Come thou no more for ransom, gentle herald. They shall have none, I swear, but these my joints, which, if they have, as I shall leave them, shall yield them little. Tell the constable.
I shall, King Harry. And so fare thee well. Thou never shalt hear herald any more.
Wow, and double wow. Slightly spine-tingling. The music obviously helps, and this featured in our first supplementary Music in the Movies, where we played Richard Burton, just as eloquent an orator as Kenneth Branagh, but recorded on stage giving a performance of Henry V. Without the music, it just falls a bit flat, to be honest, and this is the music creates such an atmosphere behind it. Anyway, enough of me getting all tingly and patriotic and English, and we should continue with the synopsis. After the speech, the Duke of York asks Henry if he can lead the vanguard, and he's granted the honour. The vanguard is the leading battle of the army. Men cross themselves, touch earth to their lips, and take their lines. So the reality of the lead-up, the stakes really were used. Each archer was told to cut a 6-foot stake and sharpen it at each end. And these were used to fashion a palisade behind which the archers would have some protection against the French cavalry. As far as the famous speech goes, we hear that Henry actually wasn't big on making long speeches. One historian I heard said her favourite version of what he really said pretty much went no further than, "All right, lads, let's get it done," which I found quite funny and completely at odds with what Shakespeare has us believe. But yeah, it's a pretty wonderful speech anyway. So back to the play, and chorus tells us this is Agincourt, as we see the mounted French fit their helmets, the English some mounted but mostly on foot. They're waiting as bundles of arrows are handed out to the archers. They start to fire fire? Did I say fire? There's no fire. Loose. Volley after volley of arrows at the French, as the knights engage each other on horseback and then on foot. We see the Dauphin fighting, Henry too, and both are bareheaded, which is useful because we can see who they are, as men on horse and foot fight in the mud-soaked field. Nym and Pistol are in the midst of it. Nym robs each Frenchman as he kills him. As he cuts a Persian one body, though, a French soldier stabs him to death. We then see the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, dismounted and nearly drowning. He's rescued by the Duke of Orleans and the Dauphin, as the Duke of York is killed on the English side, surrounded by a group of French soldiers. Pistol has found the body of Nym and cries as the French constable dies in the arms of Orleans and the Dauphin, who then decide with an angry defiance to die fighting, and they charge back into the fray. Really, the reality of the battle. We don't know exactly what happened, but it is one of the better recorded battles of this period. And one element that Shakespeare and Branagh both get right is the composition of the armies, which was very different. The vast majority of the French, certainly those who became engaged during the battle, were men-at-arms. These are armed and mounted like knights that we'd normally picture, although most of them wouldn't have actually been knights. That was a title of nobility. The type of soldier that the French had, though, were very expensive. They needed a horse, they needed plate armour, they needed swords. The English, who had much less money than the French, had long ago realised that archers are much cheaper and very effective. So Henry's army probably consisted of less than 1,000 men-at-arms at nights, the remainder being almost all archers. They'd have had leather gherkins as protection and short swords for hand-to-hand combat when it came to it after using their arrows. The longbow, often referred to as the Welsh longbow, although it wasn't invented by the Welsh, it had been used by them against Edward I with great effect, and this is one of the reasons that the English kings took it on so enthusiastically. They've calculated from the girth of the longbows found on the Mary Rose, which admittedly is the following century, would have taken a drawing strength of up to 200 pounds, which is quite incredible. I listened to an archery expert called Mike Loades talk about Agincourt with Dan Snow on his History Hits podcast. Now, Mike Loades thinks that during this period, a normal battlefield pull will be about 120 to 150 pounds. Now, that's still an enormous amount of power, but if, like me, you were thinking, I don't really have anything to compare it to, he gave a really good modern example. The average Olympic archer today is pulling around 30 pounds. So you're looking at 4 to 5 times the power of an Olympic bow and arrow. So the longbow was an incredible weapon. Another thing that Mike Loades suggested is that this very iconic image of clouds of arrows being fired on an upward trajectory to then descend onto the French army is actually something invented by Laurence Olivier in the 1944 Henry V, and there is no evidence that medieval archers shot like this. All the medieval tapestries and images show them firing virtually horizontally, and at these angles and at closer ranges, Mike Loades says that yes, arrows with bodkin heads could penetrate plate armour, but circumstances had to be right for this to happen. The strike had to be at right angles so it didn't glance off, at fairly close range, and even then the best armour could stop an arrow. Horses, however, were very vulnerable to archers, so the cavalry could certainly be hurt by archers, but equally, if archers were caught in the open by cavalry, they could be butchered. So it was a real balance. We'll go back to the movie and we see Henry with the body of the Duke of York, and he rallies his men to a final effort, telling them that they have fought valiantly, but the French still keep the field. We see him cross swords with the Dauphin as rain pours down on the battling armies. Boy, the Christian Bale character, is with the baggage train when some French riders attack them. Most of the English run to the carts, Henry included, to find slaughtered youths, the attendants of the baggage train. Our lad, Boy, is dead too. Llewellyn and Gower wander amongst them as Henry's household knights arrive. Llewellyn raves that this is against all the law of arms. Knaves and rascals, he declares the French to be. Henry is furious, and then we see the herald Montjoy arrive, and Henry throws him to the ground, demanding to know if he's come again for ransom. But Montjoy says no, he's just come to seek permission for the French to collect their dead. Henry, confused, says, "Truly, I don't know if I've won the day or not," and Montjoy tells him, "The day is yours." A stunned Henry stands and is joined by Captain Llewellyn, who reminds him that it was close to where they stood that Henry's grandfather and great-uncle won another great battle, where the Welsh did good service. The archers stood in a garden where leeks grew, and wearing the leeks in their Monmouth caps, which became a badge of honour. This he's referring to the Battle of Crecy, and indeed, It may well be that the French were in a garden with leeks and they tucked them in their caps to eat later, and from that point on the leek became a national symbol of Wales. So the reality, as far as we know, Henry deserves a lot of credit. He sheltered his archers partly in woods and those in the open behind stakes, and he deployed them on the wings of his army, almost funneling the French into the centre. We believe that the French initially refused to attack, knowing that they had the stronger position, they were better supplied. Henry also didn't want to attack. He wanted to bring the French onto him. So he advanced his army enough of a distance that the archers got within longbow range and started to fire at the French. With some predictability, this annoyed them and they decided to take on the English. Now, we believe the initial French attack was actually on foot. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and the Marshal of France, a guy called Jean Le Mongret, but known as Boucicaut, they seem to have actually decided that discipline was the way forward, and rather than take their horses across this increasingly muddy field, they should attack on foot. Their plan being that they would engage the English knights in the centre, whilst the French cavalry could then sweep around the archer wings and wrap up the whole line. Despite having chosen the ground, the French were first hindered by very wet ground that quickly they churned into mud. And there was also some good psychology used by Henry, or plain good luck, as yet again the French nobles saw archers as beneath their dignity to fight, because they were drawn from common people. So they concentrated on the centre all the time, being slammed by arrows from the flanks. The French command was also problematic. We've mentioned that Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, shared command with Jean Le Mongret, or Boucicaut as he was known, yet neither of them could really impose what we would think of as disciplined command on the various sub-commanders. There was great rivalry about taking the honour of breaking the English lines, so French discipline quickly broke down as mounted knights tried to charge as other groups advanced on foot, all of them clogging up the battlefield, and all the while being absolutely hammered by English and Welsh archers loosing their volleys. Mike Loades points out that the French had crossbowmen aplenty held in reserve behind the lines, but they never deployed them. Many of the French drowned in the mud, trapped in their armour, but not because they couldn't move unaided. These were athletes. I mean, these guys would train in full armour, sparring, fighting, leaping on horses. They really were quite incredible. But it's the crush of people behind them and in front, combined with the depth of water and mud, did for a lot of them. And if anyone's ever been in a crowd situation where a surge starts, it can be absolutely terrifying, the power of a large group of people. Particularly, you can imagine, when they're in armour and their blood's up, they have limited vision and their adrenaline's pumping because they're going into a fight. There doesn't seem to have been a great rout or a countercharge by the English. The battle almost seems to have fizzled out as the French, group by group, were either killed, captured, or simply left, realising that they weren't going to win the day. Now, two controversies remain, both covered by Shakespeare in his full play, but only one shown in Branagh's movie version, and Olivier in the 40s took the same route as Branagh. The first is this attack on the English baggage train. Some French cavalry did, by all accounts, attack the English baggage train, whether trying to get behind the English lines or to plunder it, we'll never know. And in doing so, they killed many of the boys and servants guarding it. However, Henry had positioned a small force of archers, a few hundred archers, behind the lines for any French encirclement attempt, and they managed to break this attack up. In Shakespeare's play, this is the cause for the next controversy, which is Henry ordering all the French prisoners to be killed. Now, neither movie shows this reaction to the death of the boys. We do know, or we believe, that it did happen. Henry did give an order to kill the prisoners. However, this doesn't seem to have been in response to an attack on the baggage train, which was not against all the laws of combat, as Captain Llewellyn would have us believe. Perfectly legitimate, and, if you were a young boy guarding a wagon, and if you got killed, then it was just the fortunes of war. Henry, however, seems to have reasoned that too many of his men have left the line of battle to secure their prisoners, who, should they be of a rank that warrants a ransom, could make a man rich. An archer, common folk, could turn themselves into a wealthy businessman if they could capture a knight. So many of them, having captured these French nobles, had dragged them to the rear and were actually guarding them, which means that the English were losing people out of the line as well. Henry, worried that the French would rally and return to the attack, gave the ruthless order. However, given the amount of French prisoners who were subsequently brought back to England, either not many of his soldiers followed the order, or there's an element of myth about this particular aspect of the battle. Interestingly, in 2010, a US court held a mock trial in which they found Henry guilty of war crimes. So, yeah, that was worthwhile. As we've often said before, you have to look at it through the eyes of his contemporaries. The French didn't really make a big noise about this. It was mildly shocking. But again, they may have been feeling that, okay, we lost the battle. It just looks like sour grapes if we start whining about prisoners being killed. And it was the sort of thing that would happen from time to time. Back to the play, and we see Pistol despondent that he's lost his friend Nym, and somehow he's received word that Nell, Mistress Quickly, is dead. And another opportunity for me to try to say Dame Judi Dench. The Herald Montjoy is back with Henry, and he hands him a list of French casualties.
Herald, are the dead numbers?
Here is the number of the slaughtered French.
This note doth tell me of 10,000 French that in the field lie slain. Of princes in this number 126. Added to these of knights, esquires, and gallant gentlemen, 8,400, of the which 500 were but yesterday dubbed knights. Here was a royal fellowship of death. Where is the number of our English dead? Edward, the Duke of York, the Earl of Suffolk, Sir Richard Keikley, Davy Gam, Esquire, none else of name, and of all other men, but 25. 'Tis wonderful. Come. Go we in procession to the village. And be it death proclaimed through our host to boast of this, or take that praise from God which is his only.
Is not lawful and please your majesty to tell how many is killed?
Aye, Captain, but with this acknowledgement, that God fought for us.
Yes, my conscience. He did us great good.
Now, I've got a little bit of an issue with Shakespeare's Henry V here. Before the battle, remember the St. Crispin's Day We Band of Brothers speech where he'd said, "He who outlives this day shall, on the anniversary, will strip his sleeve, show his scars, say, these wounds I had on Crispin's Day." All that stuff about basically you'll never have to buy a pint yourself when you're down the pub because you can just say, yep, I was there. Now, they've done it the unexpected. They've pulled off this incredible victory. And he's saying, no, you boast about it, I'll have your head chopped off. The praise goes to God alone. I'd feel a little bit miffed. I really would. Anyway, I suppose he was a politician of sorts. Now, Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, in Shakespeare's play doesn't die, but in reality he did. So we have both Olivier and Branagh's movie versions showing that he did die on the battlefield. Jean Le Mongre, Le Boucicaut, as he was known, the other leader of the French army, he was captured and died in captivity in England a few years later. The French did lose thousands of men killed, many captured, but most of the captured ones were men of means, being mounted and armoured. The English probably almost certainly lost more than the 29 or whatever it was mentioned in Shakespeare's play, but it's certainly no more than a few hundred. We'll go back to the movie now, and the final scenes. We see King Charles of France and Henry of England meeting, accompanied by their nobles. They address each other as brothers. The meeting is being administered by the Duke of Burgundy. He appeals for peace. Henry replies that peace will be theirs, provided France agrees to his just and reasonable demands. Charles says he'll consider them and give his answer promptly. The French and English leave the room, leaving Henry to court Catherine, who's clearly part of the deal, and remains accompanied by her maid. And we see a scene that we don't need to go into great detail about, but it's basically Henry wooing her. I would just like to quote one line from it, where he's saying, "Look, I can't dance or talk poetry. I'm a simple soldier. If I could win a wife by vaulting into my saddle with my armour on, I should leap into a wife and lay on like a butcher, never off." Now, I can't speak for anyone else, but to me, that's a little bit on the salacious side. A bit risque, but then Shakespeare is, if you read a copy of Shakespeare that hasn't gone through the Victorian morality filter. Anyway, Henry is wooing Catherine, who says to him, "Can I love the enemy of France?" And he says, "I'm not the enemy of France. I love France so well, I will not part with a single village of it." Which is a clever way of saying, yeah, I'm in charge now. He speaks in French worse than Catherine's English, but there's some humour and humility. But as they're about to kiss, the nobility come back in with the French King Charles, who tells Henry they have consented to the terms. Both men sign the document before Charles joins Henry and Catherine's hands. The camera pans away from the group, and we hear Chorus's final words.
Thus far, with rough and all unable pen, our bending author hath pursued the story. In little room confining mighty men, mangling by starts the full course of their glory. Small time, but in that small, most greatly lived this Star of England. Fortune made his sword, by which the world's best garden he achieved, and of it left his son, imperial lord. Henry VI, in infant bands crowned King of France and England, did this king succeed, whose state so many had the managing, that they lost France, and made his England bleed.
So the final reality check and conclusion. The scenes with the Treaty of Troyes, which is what we see the negotiation, they didn't actually happen for 5 years after Agincourt. That time was spent in continued war, and in 1420 the treaty was signed, but the negotiations took 6 months, not 5 minutes. It's also worth mentioning that the Dauphin, who the movie shows being told by King Charles he must remain with his father in Rouen, and yet we see at the battle, was no longer the Dauphin because he was no longer alive. He did stay with his father, he never went to Agincourt, and a few months after the battle he died from illness. His brother succeeded him, but he also died within a couple of years, and by the time of the Treaty of Troyes, the Dauphin was an even younger son, Charles, who would remain Dauphin until 1422, when his father Charles VI died, and he claimed the throne. However, this was a bit fraught, because part of the Treaty of Troyes is that Henry V would not become King of France, but he was named as Charles VI's heir. As he was much younger, people expected that this is how the succession would go, and then we would have seen a united King of England and France. Henry V, unfortunately, died a few months before King Charles, possibly from dysentery whilst besieging a French town. Another theory is that it was actually heat stroke that took him, as his decline and death happened in a very short period. Henry's infant son, Henry VI, was said to have succeeded to the throne of France, but in truth this never really happened, and the regents, who were mainly concerned with England, allowed the French to largely take back all the victories of Henry V's reign, or most of them. Battles did continue, and it was the new Dauphin who, when he became Charles VII, and partly thanks to Joan of Arc, managed to expel the English and emerge the victor, as this saw the end of the 100 Years' War. Chorus's conclusion is succinct and pretty accurate. Henry VI inherited few of his father's strengths, but he seems to have inherited some of the Valois traits through his mother. He suffered prolonged bouts of depression and possible insanity. At times he was virtually catatonic, and these reared regularly and frequently throughout his life, which was a fatal weakness for a king, and certainly contributed to the causes of the Wars of the Roses. In conclusion, I do love this version of Shakespeare's play. It's a great film to watch. It's readily available on most streaming services, and even if you're not really dialed into Shakespearean language, it's understandable, as hopefully you've gathered from the clips we've played. I don't recommend Olivier's, but I know that some cinema classic lovers will say it is a classic in its own right. To me, it just looks like a bunch of thespians who filmed a stage with cardboard scenery. I'm not a huge fan. Accuracy, it's not really stretching above a 6, 7 at most. There's a lot of compression of time. I know we've forgiven that in the past, but and I suppose some of the inaccuracies could be put down to the fact that Shakespeare's trying to minimise the number of actors actually required. For example, the Duke of Exeter turning up again and again when he was in Harfleur for the whole period. The Dauphin turning up on the battlefield, whereas in fact he was in Rouen with his dad. So maybe a 7. Anyway, that sees the end of part 1 of this episode of Shakespeare at the Cinema, and we'll be back next week with myself being joined by Derek Burks for Richard III, and that's an even bigger episode. So apologies for the very lengthy intro. We had quite a lot of start of the new year wrap-ups to get done, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to inflict it on you, or maybe you like it like me. But we will go out with Patrick Doyle's beautiful music set to the medieval prayer Non Nobis Domine, which, thanks to the power of Google, I've discovered means "Not to us, O Lord." And it's the opening line in a hymn that was an expression of humility and devotion and thanks to God, where they'd say, "Not to us the glory, but to you, O Lord," which very much fits in with Henry doing a complete volte-face at the end of the battle and say, no, you know, I said you could brag about this. No, you can tell I've got a beam up on it about this. It's really bad leadership. You promise you'll add something, they pull off what you want them to do, they work their nuts off, and then at the end of it you go, no, I've changed my mind. No, you can't say that. Anyway, here it is, and enjoy, and we'll be back next week with Richard III, which is not intended as Cockney rhyming slang.